So let's take quick stock of the world in 1900. We know that in the United States there has been a substantial urban migration. A large part of that has been in the Northeast, from Philly up through Boston. Industrialization is still heavily urban. The migration to the south will occur later. We know that the unrest of the 1880s has carried forward. Symbolically, William Jennings Bryan died. He did so roughly 2 weeks after the Scopes monkey trial. Are you familiar with what that was about? Okay. No surprise, in the state of Tennessee, Scopes was arrested for teaching evolution. Clarence Darrow, one of the top lawyers of his day and a professed atheist, cross-examined William Jennings Bryan on the witness stand. And the result was that Bryan was devastated, emotionally, intellectually broken, and humiliated. Shortly after that, he died. Now, the extent to which his humiliation at the hands of Darrow led to his death, we can debate. But what's particularly interesting for the conversation here is the fact that even though he was not a member of the KKK burned crosses across the United States when they learned of his death. He was similarly a proponent of total separation of races, along the same lines as Lincoln. All right, any questions so far? That unrest, if you recall, there was a huge debate about the question of population and the perception, at least, that real white people, Northern European whites, were producing fewer children. And the population gap, if you want to think of it in those terms, is largely being filled by immigrants. So while the United States increases in population during this period, it's not because Northern European whites who are citizens are reproducing in great numbers. Additionally, underneath this, there's a growing sense that the United States, or America in general, North America, it can be a utopian experiment. So European authors cite the fact that the United States is untouched and full of possibilities. None of the baggage of Europe means that there's a clean slate. Start fresh. You can probably already see that missing in this conversation is any discussion of Native Americans. None. Never figured into the equation. Make sense? Okay. They will largely end in failure. In fact, one of Holyoake's associates, who is extremely wealthy, will try repeatedly at various places in the United States to build a utopian world. And there's a general failure. So by the time that we hit 1900, there is a growing sense of disillusion, a kind of fearfulness. If you want to think of both of these as a growing anxiety, that's fine. So as unsettled as the world already is, as we've mentioned previously, the idea of race suicide is codified in 1910. There is a brief optimism because of World War I, insofar as it is the war to end all wars. It also marks the beginning of the United States' global position as a potential power. One of the lines from post-World War I is, now that the boys have seen Gay Paris, how are we going to keep them on the farm? And to a great extent, this changed America's perception of itself and the world. However much that's true, remember our discussion last week about millennialism and its rise in 1844. So there is a juxtaposition between the power of the manufacturing base and the new wealthy the industrialists, in contrast to the old money. And this begins a kind of flourishing of an American culture even more free from its European roots than it had been. It's particularly interesting that aspects of millennialism will be embraced by the intelligentsia. And for some period of time, a lot of that occurs in New York City. Pittsburgh will be another place. So it's almost as though in those places where industrialization is altering the culture, there is the counter theme of millennialism, a kind of conservative return to the biblical faith. It's also safe to say that as immigration continues, immigrants don't go to the farmland of Iowa. They go to the ghettos of New York, Boston, Philadelphia, to a lesser extent, places like Richmond. So the social problems that were noted in the 1880s are just increasing. Okay, any questions so far? The result of this is that to a great extent the urban world will become stratified and organized around ghettos. Some of those are racial, a lot of them are ethnic. Example, it's Irish versus Italian, Germans versus Irish. Make sense? Okay. Despite all of this, once again, as we'll see in the 1950s, after World War I, much of Europe has been laid waste. As a consequence of that, America's economy is thriving. It was relatively untouched by World War I. So, The Great Gatsby, F. Scott Fitzgerald, the hedonism and decadence of the 1920s will parallel the 1950s, or conversely. I haven't done enough research to conclusively argue what I'm about to say, but I would bet that during this period, the same objectification of women that will occur in the 1960s occurs here. Women shed the floor length garments of the 19th century. The flapper comes in, one piece bathing suits. There are significant challenges to traditional culture. The bottom falls out. With the Great Depression. I think if we go back and look at the events that begin around 1880, and I think that symbolically it will be represented in the Scopes monkey trial. American culture at a very deep level appears to be split between a new secularism and a more traditional conservative religious posture. One of the themes that we want to look at, if I don't know that we'll finish it today, but if not, when we return, I get the sense that there is a growing sense that traditional faith can't address the problems. If the church had been effective, the churches had been effective. I think you could argue that the potential communist revolution in the United States would never have occurred. That what we now call socialism would not have occurred. This separation is in part responsible for the rise of millennialism. And millennialism, insofar as it's focused on the end of time, does not attempt to offer a concrete solution to the social problems we face. Buck up, tolerate it, the end is near. Does that make sense? So if you think about the life of Holyoke, the fact that his mother is paying the church tax while his sister dies is symbolic of what's happening to the church in the 19th century. A large part of that separation will take place around science versus religion. Remember also when we talked about the life of Charles Darwin, symbolically his life embodied this tension. While he never clearly came out and said, I'm an atheist for a large part of his life, he certainly behaved and wrote that way. But we know that towards the end of his life, he appeared to shift back the other way. So once again, when we think about the Scopes monkey trial, what ultimately happens is that religion fails. So the point that I want to make is that by the time we get to 1930, after the Great Depression, Christianity's influence diminishes. Okay, any questions so far? Okay. If this were world religions, I would tell you that there are generally two reactions to radical changes in society. One is the development of new religions and or a schism. The other is an attempt to consolidate and to regroup. If you think about it, then from 1844, there are a lot of schisms. For example, Jehovah's Witnesses date to this period. The Seventh-day Adventists, and more. The number of non-denominational Christian churches begins to grow. And they will largely flourish throughout the 20th into the 21st century. On the other hand, the so-called mainline churches are attempting to consolidate. Not necessarily in terms of becoming one church, but ecumenism. Instead of stressing the differences, what do we share in common? And the World Council of Churches was intended to become the common voice of Christians throughout the world. So in the first phase, 1918 to 1933, The goal is to find an established common ground. I know last week we said 1932, it's actually 33. And the focus, therefore, is on doctrine, not on action. So even now, that focus on doctrine, not action, remains a large part of what the World Council of Churches is about. So when you think about the focus on doctrine and dogma and not on action, the consequence of this is that all of the social problems remain unaddressed, and the church continues to be largely ineffective. Okay, any questions? Okay. So much of the early 20th century is an attempt to find an answer, to reground Christianity. And meanwhile, the social problems continue to grow. And with the Great Depression, the entire country is down on its knees. There is an urgency. How do we make this relevant? How do we fix this? So, the first response by the World Council of Churches was called contextual morality. It's fascinating when you read what was happening in their thought process, because the question initially was, how do we determine what it means to be moral? In the modern world. Though they don't put it this way, there's a growing sense, I think, that they realize that the old way of doing things, the Ten Commandments and established Christian doctrine, doesn't work anymore. And in the face of moral bankruptcy, what do? The answer, which is really pretty novel, well, we got to teach Christians how to be moral. And that became a question of the moral decision in a given context. So there's a movement away from a kind of universal moral code to a more particular situational moral code. By the 1950s, and I was 2 years off on the date, in 1954, when the paper on social justice is released by the World Council of Churches, the focus becomes acting in a Christian way. In a non-Christian world. This, in 1963, becomes situational ethics. So thinking about the implications of this, when you begin to move away from a universal moral code toward one that's shaped by the context or the circumstance, then by definition, there is a greater reliance on the individual. Questions, thoughts? Am I making sense? Is this clear? Yeah, yeah. So if you remember from philosophy, we talked about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I can't tell you that Christianity was completely silent, but I can tell you that to a great extent, Christianity either feigned it didn't know what was going on or didn't do much to stop it. There's increasing evidence that suggests that the Catholic Church knew, that the Catholic Church made a kind of unholy bargain with with the Nazis, and to a great extent in Germany, Austria, and other places, the clergy was quick to align with Hitler. So when the Holocaust ends, again, if you go back to philosophy and you remember Elie Wiesel, the dominating theological question becomes, how does this happen? And that will be incredibly powerful in Judaism. It will resonate to a lesser extent, but still resonate with Christianity. So in the middle of this debate, go back to something we've talked about before, Once again, we see a significant shift to the right, to the conservative. The answer doesn't ultimately become, let me rephrase that. No answer is really produced by the Fourth Great Awakening. There's rather a kind of spiritual resignation. It's also interesting that among the Jewish responses to the Holocaust, there are rabbis who will argue that the Holocaust was deserved because diaspora Jews had not returned to Palestine. And they will argue that if all of the Jews throughout the world don't return, it'll happen again. And eventually, God will become so angry that all the Jews will be destroyed if they don't go home. The way that I see it, there's a similar kind of resignation in the Christian churches. There's a sense that so we can't fix it. We just have to learn to live with it. This furthers focus on the end of time. When I think about this, every time that this has occurred in history that I'm aware of, rather than the community taking action, the community resigns itself. Suffering, injustice are all temporary. The kingdom of God is at hand. We just need to wait it out. And in fact, the more we suffer, the closer we must be to the kingdom of God. So rather than action, the result is inaction. So I can't tell you, in part because I can't find the paper, whether or not the World Council of Churches paper on social justice in 1954 was a call to action. But the net effect was that in some parts of Christianity, it became a call to action. If you recall, we said that at the end of the 19th century, with people like Josiah Strong and Washington Gladden, we find the roots of the social gospel. Well, here we are 80 years later, and the paper on social justice becomes a major factor in a kind of resurrection of the social gospel. Whether intended or not, the Death of God movement begins to codify its argument by 1960. The implications as they struggle to find a unified voice is that the test of faith is less about theology, more about action and responsibility. At some point, one of the questions I want to look at is why the Death of God movement seems to have simply died. It has a rather meteoric rise, and in fact, in Time magazine in 1966, the cover is God Dead. The split inherent in the Scopes monkey trial between religion and science is now part of everyday life. There continues to be significant resistance in many parts of the South to the teaching of evolution. But you also have people like Madeline Murray winning lawsuits that throws prayer out of the classroom. And the United States, in theory, becomes a much more secular country in the 1960s. Okay, questions? What can I clarify? Deanna, everything makes sense? Okay. So, communism, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, in the 1960s in Central and South America flourishes. As much as communism is anti-religion, these areas are deeply Catholic. In fact, having worked in some of these areas, you can go into a town that has nothing but abject poverty, and yet the church is magnificent. How people are able to maintain that dichotomy is not something I will ever pretend to understand. But it is very real. And it may, in fact, go back to the conversation we had about Nietzsche. Christianity flourished in the first century of the Common Era, not among the rich, but among the poor, the slaves, and the downtrodden. It provided them with a sense of hope in a world that otherwise had no hope. The result of this, which we've mentioned before, the goal of liberation theology is to make Christianity relevant in an oppressed world. It does that in part by tying the Sermon on the Mount to Marxist thinking. And throughout the 1960s, certainly as long as the United States is in Vietnam, concern about Marxism and communism is extremely high. So if you take the Sermon on the Mount seriously as a Christian, does that become a blueprint for social action? The answer for liberation theology is yes. So up until this point, the inherent contradiction between Marx's call for the end of religion and the maintenance of a Christian faith, suddenly the two are no longer inconsistent. I can be a Christian and be a Marxist. In South America, many of the South American countries will move actively towards socialism. And increasingly, Catholic priests the Berrigan brothers, and Protestant ministers, William Sloane Coffin, take an active stand against the dominance of first world countries. The Berrigan brothers were intensely outspoken critics of Vietnam, as was William Sloane Coffin. They become actively involved in ending American involvement in Vietnam. They also become actively involved in the civil rights movement, feminism. Suddenly, Christianity becomes revolutionary. Okay, making sense? Thoughts, comments, questions? Okay. When we look at liberation theology, and here I specifically want to look at Jürgen Moltmann, the suffering of Jesus becomes a kind of prototype. The tendency when we suffer is to see ourselves as suffering alone. But we are not. For Moltmann, the death of Jesus on the cross becomes absolutely critical. What appears to be the failure in his death is actually not. So for Moltmann, the Christian doctrine of incarnation becomes critically important. As outlined by Nicaea and Chalcedon, the incarnation means that Jesus is true God and true human. Implicitly, therefore, whatever the human suffers, so does God. When Jesus dies on the cross, in some way, God experiences death. Moltmann argued, and here I'm going to use words that I'm not sure he would agree with, not only is human death transformed, but so is God. For Moltmann, in very real terms, God died for us in the person of Jesus, and all human suffering is transformed. We are no longer alone. Any questions before I respond to this further?
So who exactly was that?
I'm sorry, say that again, please.
Who exactly was that?
Okay. 20th century German theologian, had fought in World War II. He is a leading, or was, I'm not sure if he's still alive, leading liberation theologian. Um, though I didn't think so when it was happening. I took a seminar with him when I was getting my doctorate at Emory, and he and I had a number of very intense conversations about this point. He said at one point that both he and I were sons of Nietzsche. The only difference was that when we stood before the cross, he went to the right and I went to the left. My problem with Moltmann, and this is sort of part of the foundation for what we've been talking about since I met the two of you, is that in very Nietzschean terms, it seems to me very black and white. If God died on the cross, if God truly died on the cross, then God is dead and we are alone. But if God didn't die on the cross, if God only pretended to die on the cross, then that was an illusion, a cruel joke. And borrowing from my Nietzschean roots, then it is best that we just kill God and take responsibility for the world ourselves. If we think about this in terms of what Nietzsche would say, Jesus' question on the cross was placed before God. God has yet to answer. We do not know. We do not know if it means God is dead, God doesn't care, God isn't interested, or potentially God is our murderer. We don't know. In any event, the question is not ours to answer. So, while I don't endorse everything that the Death of God movement said, the essence of its point, that in a world in which God is silent, the world is ours to be responsible for. At the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet says, despite all of this, love God anyway. So the God question is the same as the human question, which is the same as making the decision to love in a world in which all that is human dies. I can decide to love that God anyway, whoever that God, whatever that God might be. I think in many ways this takes us back to Camus, because one of the fundamental problems that we struggle with as humans our entire life we are alone. There is an ongoing struggle to bring an end to being alone. We love in part in order to overcome being alone. I think you could argue, if we go back to the conversations we've had about Nietzsche before, until I am alone, until I know what it means to be alone, I cannot love. Paul Tillich talked about the courage to be. 20th century theologian, Protestant. He largely attempted to tie some aspects of Christianity to existentialism. And in fact, I don't know if this is still the case because I'm obviously not connected back to a theological institution. But the debate between Tillich and Karl Barth, 19th century Protestant, is synonymous with the phrase neo-orthodoxy. In the early part of the 20th century, he did a commentary on Paul's letter to the Romans, in which he largely rebelled against what he perceived to be a liberal interpretation of Christianity, or Christianity's loss of its connection back to the ground of its faith. So when we talk about the split that occurred in part in the late 19th century, theologically in the 20th in Christianity, that becomes part of the debate between Paul Tillich and Karl Barth. Neo-orthodoxy, an attempt to tie the modern world back to its appropriate Orthodox roots. But Tillich is more focused on establishing a Christian theology that's more consistent with contemporary philosophy. And the point that I'm making here, I don't know that Tillich would put it this way, but I would argue that the courage to be is the courage to love. So while it falls somewhat outside the conversation we're having, and the subject of part 2 of my book, the question is, can faith in God be relevant? If so, what does that look like? In my more radical moments, some of which you remember, I'm sure, I would argue that the world would be a better place if we acted as though God were dead. You may remember the line from Arthur Koestler, when the dead are left to bury the dead, the living are left alone. When God is dead, the living are left alone. Questions, thoughts?
I have a question for you regarding the part where you said the death that we kill God and take responsibility for ourselves. If I remember correctly, I haven't read it all, but in the Bible it says like God gives change to meaning of the earth. So that doesn't mean like this is full of everything. So what would you assume a God to be and what that says versus what you say and how
Okay.
it's just like kill God to take responsibility. If he supposedly gave us the meaning of the earth to be in control of everything.
Yes, but if you recall, after that story, the fall occurs.
Mm-hmm.
And the point of the fall is that everything that we do is deformed. Even if we are given the choice between something which we know to be inherently good and something which we know to be inherently evil, I find it fascinating when I talk to people who aren't even Christian. Free will and original sin. And if you think about several of the conversations we've had, there is an implied and explicit dependence upon the grace of God. Paul reminds us continuously that without the grace of God, we're nothing. We can't do anything. That dependence is a convenient way of not being responsible. I can't help myself. I'm an alcoholic. I can't help myself. I'm anorexic. I can't help myself. Original sin. So we tolerate injustice. We don't fix injustice. And we live in a world which always points beyond itself. I can endure any injustice because when I die, I will be in heaven. I can endure any pain because when I die, one of my friends tells a story about going to a funeral, and the preacher got up and took his glasses off and cleaned them and said, I'm looking forward to die because when I die, I won't need these glasses anymore. Because in death, he would be free from all the limitations of the body, and his eyes would work perfectly. The Jews walked to their death, many of them praying Kaddish, the prayer for the dead. Because God would not put them there if they hadn't done something to be there. And we do the same thing. It's got to stop. If we truly face the reality of death, we would not be waging war in Ukraine. We would not be strapping explosive vests around our chests and blowing ourselves up. We enable ourselves to turn away from the world and turn away from responsibility. It's got to stop. I cannot truly love in a world in which all that is human dies if I don't confront my death. And as long as I believe in life after death, in the graciousness of the God who will fix everything I choose not to fix, I can't love. Am I making sense? You know, one of the things that the rabbinic theologians said after the Holocaust was that every time it happened, it got worse. There's a great phrase in Hebrew that I wish I could find an adequate translation for in English. Ad matai. The literal translation is how long. But until you read the Hebrew, you can't really wrap your head around the exasperation, the frustration, the depth of that emotional response. So, ad matai. How much longer will we have to endure this? So Nietzsche was right. In many respects, the God of logic and reason is the God that keeps us from being responsible for the world. The collapse of the World Council of Churches, and I would say the general failure of Christianity in the 20th and 21st century, is indicative of the fact that it can't fix it. It is caught in its own paradigm. And the more I suffer, the more God loves me. No. No. The more my father beat me, the more my father loved me? No. No. Maybe we need to go back to the Holocaust and ask the question again. Where is God now? And if we don't know, then it's time for us to become responsible. Okay, since you guys have class, let me stop the recording.